Welcome to Spirituality and Society, presented by APM Assembly of People in Mission, a congregation belonging to the Baptist denomination. As we embark on this journey together, I want to remind you of an important principle. Forget about the messenger and focus on the message. Forget about the preacher and focus on the preaching. And forget about the teacher and focus on the teaching. In other words, it's not about who is delivering the message, but rather the message itself. We're excited to have you join us on this journey as we explore a variety of topics related to spirituality and its impact on our society. Thanks for tuning in, and let's get started.
Welcome to Spirituality in Society podcast, where we explore the intersection of spirituality, language, and culture. In today's episode, we will delve into the fascinating world of figures of speech and their significance in language and communication. From the repetitive rhythms of poetry to the playful analogies of humor, figures of speech are fundamental to our ability to convey meaning and emotion through language. We will examine the various types of figures of speech, including repetition, analogy, exaggeration and attenuation, and construction, and discuss their impact on communication in different contexts. We will also explore how the use of figures of speech is woven into the fabric of literature, including the different genres of the Bible. As we journey through this exploration of the power of language, we will discover how figures of speech can enrich our spiritual lives, deepen our understanding of ourselves and others, and connect us more profoundly to the divine. So sit back, relax, and join us on this exciting journey into the heart of language and spirituality. 2 Peter 3 verses 14 to 16 is an interesting passage to consider in the context of the art of figurative language, understanding figures of speech. In this passage, the Apostle Peter urges his readers to be diligent in their pursuit of godliness and to grow in their knowledge of Christ. He also acknowledges that some of the things that the Apostle Paul wrote can be difficult to understand, and warns his readers not to twist Paul's words to their own destruction. This passage highlights the importance of understanding figures of speech in the context of the Bible. Biblical writers often used figurative language to convey complex theological concepts in a way that would be accessible and memorable to their audience. However, if we don't understand the figures of speech they are using, we run the risk of misinterpreting their words and teachings. By studying and understanding the various types of figures of speech used in the Bible, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the richness and complexity of the text. We can also gain greater insight into the theological concepts being conveyed and avoid misinterpreting them. So, let us heed Peter's admonition and be diligent in our pursuit of understanding, so that we may grow in our knowledge of Christ and the Word of God. The Bible is full of figurative language, as the writers often used various literary techniques to convey their messages. Here are some examples of biblical figures of speech. Metaphors. A metaphor is a direct comparison between two things without using the words like or as. Jesus often used metaphors in his teachings, such as I am the vine, you are the branches, John 15 verse 5, where he compares himself to a vine and his followers to branches. Similes. A simile is a comparison between two things using the words like or as. In Psalm 1 verse 3, the writer compares a righteous person to a tree planted by streams of water, saying, he is like a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Personification. Personification is when an inanimate object or idea is given human characteristics. In Proverbs 9 verse 1, wisdom is personified as a woman who has built her house and prepared a banquet, calling out to the simple to come and eat at her table. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is an exaggeration used to emphasize a point. In Matthew 23 verse 24, Jesus criticizes the religious leaders, saying, you blind guides. You strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. Irony. Irony is when the opposite of what is expected occurs. In 1 Kings 18 verse 27, Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to prove their God is real by having him light a fire under their sacrifice. When Baal fails to answer, Elijah mocks them, saying, shout louder. Perhaps he is sleeping and must be awakened. Parables. Parables are short stories used to illustrate a moral or spiritual lesson. In Luke 15, Jesus tells 3 parables about lost things: a lost sheep, a lost coin, and a lost son, to illustrate God's love for sinners and his desire to save them. Symbolism. Symbolism is the use of an object, person, or action to represent something else. In Revelation, many symbols are used to describe the end of the world, such as the beast representing evil, the lamb representing Jesus, and the dragon representing Satan. These are just a few examples of the many figures of speech found in the Bible. Understanding these literary techniques can help us better understand the messages being conveyed and apply them to our own lives. A figure of speech is a literary device that uses language in a non-literal way to create a special effect or meaning. Figures of speech can add depth and richness to language, making it more engaging and memorable for the listener or reader. They can be used to create images in the mind, convey emotions, create humor or irony, emphasize a point, or simply make language more interesting. Some common types of figures of speech include metaphors, similes, personification, hyperbole, irony, and symbolism. Metaphors and similes both compare one thing to another, but in different ways. A metaphor makes a direct comparison without using like or as, while a simile uses those words to make a comparison. Personification gives human qualities to inanimate objects or ideas, while hyperbole exaggerates something for emphasis. Irony is when the opposite of what is expected occurs, and symbolism is the use of an object or action to represent something else. Figures of speech are important because they allow us to communicate in more nuanced and expressive ways. They can help us convey complex ideas or emotions, make language more memorable, and create a more engaging experience for the listener or reader. By using figures of speech, we can paint a picture in the mind of the listener or reader and help them connect more deeply with our message. For example, a metaphor such as "life is a journey" can help us convey the ups and downs of life in a more vivid way than simply stating that life has its challenges. In summary, figures of speech are an important aspect of language that allow us to communicate more effectively and expressively. They can add depth and richness to our words and help us convey complex ideas or emotions in a memorable and engaging way. In this episode, we will discuss several different types of figures of speech. We will start with repetition figures, such as anaphora, pleonasm, gradation, parallelism, and repetition. Then, we will move on to figures of analogy, including allegory, personification, comparison, and metaphor. We will also cover the figure of exaggeration, hyperbole, and attenuation figures like understatement, preterition, euphemism, and antiphrasis. Finally, we will discuss construction figures, such as antithesis, oxymoron, asyndeton, and polysyndeton. We will also touch on the use of figures of speech in the Bible and how different literary genres require different interpretations of figures of speech. Overall, the episode will provide an overview of the various types of figures of speech and their importance in language, communication, and literature. We will explore how each figure of speech can be used to create a special effect or meaning, and how understanding figures of speech can enhance our understanding and appreciation of language. Repetition figures. Repetition figures are figures of speech that involve the repetition of words, phrases, or clauses to create a specific effect. They are a common technique in literature, poetry, and speeches, and can be used to create emphasis, rhythm, and an overall sense of unity and coherence. Anaphora is one of the most common repetition figures. It involves the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive sentences or clauses. For example, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, he repeats the phrase "I have a dream" to emphasize his vision for racial equality. Pleonasm is another repetition figure that involves the use of unnecessary or redundant words or phrases. It is often used for emphasis or to create a specific effect. For example, the phrase free gift is a pleonasm because a gift is already implied to be free. Gradation is a repetition figure that involves words or phrases arranged in a successive order of increasing or decreasing intensity or importance. It is often used to create a sense of climax or to build tension. For example, in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony says, "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones." Parallelism is another repetition figure that involves the repetition of grammatical structures or patterns. It creates a sense of symmetry and balance and is often used for rhetorical effect. For example, in Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he says, "Government of the people, by the people, for the people." Repetition is a repetition figure that involves the repeated use of a word or phrase for emphasis or effect. It can create a sense of rhythm and unity in a text. For example, in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, the repeated phrase "nevermore" emphasizes the narrator's sense of loss and despair. Overall, repetition figures are important because they can create a variety of effects in language and literature, including emphasis, rhythm, coherence, and rhetorical impact. By using repetition figures effectively, writers and speakers can capture and hold their audience's attention, convey their message more powerfully, and create a lasting impression. Anaphora, pleonasm, gradation, parallelism, and repetition are all examples of repetition figures, which involve the repetition of words, phrases, or clauses to create a specific effect in language and literature. Anaphora is the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. It is often used in speeches and poetry to create emphasis, rhythm, and a sense of urgency. One famous example of anaphora is Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, in which he repeats the phrase "I have a dream" to emphasize his vision for racial equality. Pleonasm is the use of redundant words or phrases, such as free gift or close proximity. It can be used for emphasis or to create a specific effect in writing, but it can also be considered poor writing style in some contexts. Gradation is the arrangement of words or phrases in a successive order of increasing or decreasing intensity or importance. It is often used to create a sense of climax or to build tension. For example, William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar uses gradation in Mark Antony's famous speech, "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones." Parallelism involves the repetition of grammatical structures or patterns, such as "government of the people, by the people, for the people" in Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. It creates a sense of symmetry and balance and can be used for rhetorical effect. Repetition is the repeated use of a word or phrase for emphasis or effect, such as the repeated phrase "nevermore" in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. It can create a sense of rhythm and unity in a text, but overuse can also make the writing feel repetitive and tiresome. Overall, these repetition figures are important tools in writing and speaking because they can create a variety of effects and help writers and speakers convey their message more powerfully and effectively. Here are more detailed definitions and examples of each repetition figure. Anaphora, the repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses or sentences. Example: in the famous speech by Martin Luther King Jr., "I have a dream," he repeats the phrase "I have a dream" at the beginning of several sentences, such as "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Pleonasm, the use of more words than necessary to convey a meaning, often for emphasis or stylistic effect. Example: "He died of a fatal disease" is an example of pleonasm, since fatal already implies that the disease caused death. Gradation, the arrangement of words, phrases, or clauses in a succession of ascending or descending order of importance or significance. Example: In Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, Mark Antony says, "I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them, the good is oft interred with their bones." Parallelism, the use of grammatically similar or identical structures or patterns in successive clauses, sentences, or paragraphs. Example: in Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he says, "We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live." Repetition, the use of a word, phrase, or sentence more than once for emphasis or effect. Example: in Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, he repeats the word nevermore throughout the poem, as in the line, "And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting, on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamplight o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor, shall be lifted, nevermore." Repetition is a powerful tool in language that can create a variety of effects. Here are some examples. Emphasis: when a word or phrase is repeated, it draws attention to itself and emphasizes its importance. For example, in Martin Luther King Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech, he uses the repetition of "I have a dream" to emphasize the importance of his vision for racial equality. Rhythm: repetition can create a pleasing rhythm in language, making it more memorable and enjoyable to listen to. For example, in the nursery rhyme "Mary Had a Little Lamb," the repetition of the word fleece creates a musical rhythm. Unity: repetition can create a sense of unity and coherence in a text, linking different parts together. For example, in the song "Old MacDonald Had a Farm," the repetition of the phrase E-I-E-I-O creates a sense of unity between the different animals and their sounds. Irony: repetition can also be used for ironic effect, by highlighting the absurdity or contradiction of a situation. For example, in George Orwell's Animal Farm, the pigs repeat the phrase "all animals are equal" while they become more and more oppressive and unequal. In general, repetition can be a very effective way to make a point or create a memorable message in language. However, too much repetition can become monotonous and lose its impact, so it is important to use it judiciously. Analogy figures. Analogy figures of speech are used to create comparisons between different things, to help the audience understand one thing in terms of another. Here are some examples of analogy figures of speech. Allegory: this is a story or narrative that has a deeper symbolic meaning. The characters and events in the story represent abstract concepts, such as love, justice, or freedom. For example, in the novel Animal Farm, the animals on the farm represent different social classes, and their struggle for power represents the history of the Soviet Union. Personification: this figure of speech gives human characteristics to non-human things, such as animals, objects, or natural phenomena. For example, the wind howled in the night, or the flowers danced in the breeze. Comparison: this figure of speech creates a direct comparison between two things, using words such as like or as. For example, she was as quiet as a mouse, or he ran like the wind. Metaphor: this figure of speech also creates a comparison between two things, but without using a direct comparison word such as like or as. For example, the classroom was a zoo, or her eyes were pools of sadness. Analogy figures of speech can be very effective in helping people understand complex concepts or ideas by relating them to something more familiar or concrete. They can also be used to create vivid imagery and add interest and variety to language. However, like all figures of speech, they should be used with care, as too much analogy can become confusing or overbearing. Here are some examples and explanations of each of these analogy figures of speech. Allegory: an allegory is a type of story or narrative in which the characters, events, and objects have a symbolic meaning. The purpose of an allegory is to convey a deeper message or moral lesson through the use of these symbols. For example, George Orwell's novel Animal Farm is an allegory for the rise of communism in the Soviet Union, with the animals on the farm representing different social classes and the pigs representing the communist leaders. Personification. Personification is a figure of speech in which human characteristics are attributed to non-human objects or concepts. This can help to make these objects or concepts seem more relatable or understandable to the audience. For example, the wind howled angrily through the night, or the sun smiled down on us from the sky. Comparison. Comparison is a figure of speech in which two things are compared using words such as like or as. This can be used to create vivid imagery and help the audience to understand a concept or idea by relating it to something more concrete or familiar. For example, her eyes were as blue as the ocean, or his voice was like velvet. Metaphor. A metaphor is similar to a comparison, but instead of using words such as like or as, it directly equates one thing with another. For example, life is a journey, or love is a rose. Metaphors can be very effective at conveying complex ideas or emotions in a simple and relatable way. All of these analogy figures of speech can be very powerful tools for writers and speakers, helping to convey complex ideas in a way that is relatable and memorable for the audience. However, it's important to use them carefully and appropriately, as overuse or misuse of analogy figures can lead to confusion or miscommunication. Here are definitions and examples of each type of analogy figure. Allegory. An allegory is a narrative or description that uses concrete or physical representations to convey an abstract or moral concept. It involves using extended metaphors to convey complex ideas. A well-known example is the allegory of the cave in Plato's Republic, in which he uses the image of prisoners chained in a cave to represent the state of ignorance of most people. Personification. Personification is a figure of speech in which human attributes or characteristics are given to non-human things or concepts. It is a way of making abstract concepts more concrete and relatable. For example, in William Wordsworth's poem I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, the clouds are personified as dancing and tossing their heads. Comparison. A comparison is a figure of speech that draws parallels between two things to highlight their similarities or differences. It often uses words like or as. For example, he's as quiet as a mouse. Metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech that describes one thing in terms of another. Unlike a simile, which uses like or as, a metaphor suggests a direct comparison between two unlike things. For example, life is a journey. In all of these analogy figures, the speaker or writer is using one thing to explain or represent another thing. They help create vivid and memorable images in the reader's mind, and can make complex ideas easier to understand. Analogies are important in communication because they help us to convey complex or abstract ideas in a more concrete and relatable way. When we use analogies, we take something that may be unfamiliar or difficult to understand and compare it to something that is more familiar or easier to grasp. This can make the idea more accessible to the listener or reader. Analogies are particularly useful when we need to explain something technical or scientific to someone who may not have a background in that field. For example, a doctor might use an analogy to explain a medical condition to a patient, or a teacher might use an analogy to explain a complex concept to a student. Analogies can also be used to make a persuasive argument. By comparing something that is already familiar and accepted with something that is new or unknown, we can make the case that the new thing is worth considering. This is often used in advertising, where a product is compared to something else that is well-known and desirable. Overall, analogies can help us to connect with others, clarify complex ideas, and make a persuasive case for something. They are a powerful tool in communication, and can be used in a variety of contexts to help us better understand and connect with others. Exaggeration and attenuation figures. Exaggeration and attenuation figures are two categories of figures of speech that are used to convey emphasis or to soften the impact of a statement. Exaggeration figures are used to emphasize a point by exaggerating it beyond what is reasonable or expected. These figures of speech are often used in humor or satire, but can also be used to make a serious point. Examples of exaggeration figures include hyperbole, an extreme exaggeration, such as "I've been waiting for hours." Irony, a statement that is the opposite of what is expected, such as "This traffic is so great," when stuck in a traffic jam. Caricature, a drawing or description that exaggerates a person's features or behavior for comic effect. Attenuation figures, on the other hand, are used to downplay or soften the impact of a statement. These figures of speech are often used in situations where the truth might be difficult to hear or to avoid causing offense. Examples of attenuation figures include euphemism, a mild or indirect word or expression used in place of one considered to be too harsh or blunt, such as "passed away" instead of "died." Understatement, a statement that makes something seem less important or serious than it really is, such as "It's just a flesh wound after losing an arm in battle." Litotes, a double negative that is used to make an understated or ironic point, such as "She's not the brightest bulb in the box," to suggest that someone is not very intelligent. Overall, exaggeration and attenuation figures are powerful tools in language that can be used to add emphasis, create humor, or soften the impact of a statement. However, it's important to use them judiciously and to consider the context in which they are being used. Here is an overview of each type of figure. Hyperbole, this is a figure of speech that involves exaggerating something for emphasis or effect. For example, "I'm so hungry, I could eat a horse." Understatement, this is the opposite of hyperbole, where something is intentionally downplayed or made to seem less important than it actually is. For example, "Oh, it's just a little scratch," when a wound is actually bleeding profusely. Preterition, this is a figure of speech where the speaker pretends to ignore or pass over something, but actually draws attention to it. For example, "I'm not even going to mention the fact that you were late again." Euphemism, this is a figure of speech that involves using a less offensive or less direct word or phrase in place of a more blunt or negative one. For example, "passed away" instead of "died." Antiphrasis, this is a figure of speech that involves saying the opposite of what you actually mean, usually for humorous or ironic effect. For example, "Oh great, another Monday," when you really mean the opposite. These figures can be used for various effects, including humor, irony, and emphasis. They can also be useful in situations where a more direct approach might be too harsh or offensive. Definition and examples of each type. Hyperbole, a figure of speech that uses exaggeration for emphasis or effect. Examples include, "I'm so hungry, I could eat a horse," or "I've told you a million times." Understatement, a figure of speech where a writer or speaker intentionally makes a situation seem less important than it really is. Examples include, "It's just a flesh wound," said by a character in the movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail after losing an arm in battle, or "I'm sure the earthquake was nothing, I barely felt it." Preterition, a figure of speech in which a writer or speaker pretends to pass over something, but actually draws attention to it. Examples include, "I won't even mention how you failed the last exam," or "I'm not saying she's a liar, but she does seem to have trouble with the truth." Euphemism, a figure of speech in which a more polite or indirect word or phrase is used to replace a more blunt or harsh one. Examples include, "passed away" instead of "died," or "let go" instead of "fired." Antiphrasis, a figure of speech in which a word or phrase is used to mean the opposite of its usual or literal meaning, often for ironic or humorous effect. Examples include, "Oh, great. Another flat tire, or thanks a lot for canceling our plans at the last minute. These figures of speech are important because they add depth and complexity to language. They allow speakers and writers to convey meaning beyond the literal definition of words, and to create emphasis, humor, irony, and other effects. They also help to make language more interesting and engaging for listeners and readers. Importance of analogies in communication. Exaggeration and attenuation figures are important in communication because they add depth and nuance to language, allowing for more precise and effective communication. Hyperbole, for example, can be used for comedic effect or to emphasize a point, while euphemisms can be used to communicate sensitive or difficult topics in a more palatable way. Antiphrasis and preterition can be used to convey irony or sarcasm, adding layers of meaning to language. Understatement, on the other hand, can be used to downplay a situation or to convey a sense of humility. These figures of speech are tools that writers and speakers can use to convey their intended message in a more engaging and memorable way. Exaggeration and attenuation figures are figures of speech that are used to add emphasis or to tone down the intensity of language. Hyperbole is an exaggeration figure that is used to magnify a statement to make it seem more impressive or remarkable. For example, saying "I've told you 1,000,000 times" is a hyperbole because the person did not actually tell you 1,000,000 times, but it emphasizes the importance of the statement. Understatement is an attenuation figure that is used to make something seem less important than it actually is. For example, if someone wins a huge award and they simply say "it's not a big deal," it is an understatement. Preterition is an attenuation figure in which the speaker pretends to ignore or avoid a topic, but they actually mention it anyway. For example, "I won't mention your terrible driving skills" is a preterition because the speaker is mentioning the topic they claim to avoid. Euphemism is an attenuation figure that replaces a harsh or unpleasant word with a more neutral or pleasant word. For example, saying "passed away" instead of "died" is a euphemism. Antiphrasis is an exaggeration figure that involves using a word to convey the opposite of its literal meaning for ironic or humorous effect. For example, calling someone tiny when they are actually very large is an antiphrasis. These figures of speech are important because they can help to make language more interesting, expressive, and memorable. By using exaggeration or attenuation figures, speakers and writers can convey complex ideas or emotions more effectively, and can create a more engaging experience for the listener or reader. Here's a brief definition and example of each. Hyperbole, an exaggerated statement or claim that is not meant to be taken literally, often used for emphasis or humorous effect. Example: "I'm so hungry, I could eat a horse." Understatement, a figure of speech in which a writer or speaker deliberately makes a situation seem less important or serious than it is. Example: "I was a little disappointed when in reality, the person was extremely upset." Preterition, a figure of speech where the speaker or writer pretends to ignore or omit something but actually makes it clear to the audience. Example: "I won't even mention how many times you've been late this week," implies that the person has been late multiple times. Euphemism, a mild or indirect word or expression used in place of one considered to be too harsh, blunt, or offensive. Example: "He passed away" instead of "he died." Antiphrasis, a figure of speech where a word or phrase is used to mean the opposite of its usual meaning for ironic or humorous effect. Example: "Great weather we're having," said sarcastically on a rainy day. These figures of speech can add depth and nuance to communication, making language more engaging and impactful. They can also help to convey complex emotions or ideas in a more accessible way. Here are the definitions and examples of each type of exaggeration and attenuation figure. Hyperbole, this figure of speech exaggerates something to make a point or create emphasis. It is often used in everyday language and humor. Example: "I am so hungry, I could eat a horse." Understatement. This figure of speech downplays something to make it seem less important or significant. Example: "It's just a flesh wound," said the knight in Monty Python and the Holy Grail after losing his arm in a sword fight. Preterition. This figure of speech pretends not to say something, but actually says it anyway. Example: "I won't mention your poor grades, but you really need to study more." Euphemism. This figure of speech uses a polite or mild word or phrase to describe something that may be unpleasant or offensive. Example: "He passed away instead of he died." Antiphrasis. This figure of speech uses a word or phrase to express the opposite of what is meant, often for humorous or ironic effect. Example: "Oh great, another Monday." When the speaker really means they are unhappy that the weekend is over. These figures of speech can add color and emphasis to language, making it more interesting and engaging to the listener or reader. They can also be used for comedic effect or to soften the impact of something that may be difficult or unpleasant to discuss. Role of exaggeration and attenuation in language, including in humor and sarcasm. Exaggeration and attenuation figures play a significant role in language as they can add humor, irony, and sarcasm to communication. Hyperbole, for example, can be used to emphasize the importance or impact of something, often to an extreme degree, and can be humorous in some contexts. On the other hand, understatement can be used to downplay something that is actually significant or to convey sarcasm. Preterition can also be used sarcastically to draw attention to something that the speaker is pretending not to say, while euphemisms can be used to soften the impact of negative or unpleasant words or phrases. Antiphrasis, or the use of words that convey the opposite of their intended meaning, can also be used for ironic or sarcastic effect. In this way, exaggeration and attenuation figures can add depth and nuance to language, making it a more powerful tool for communication. Construction figures. Construction figures are figures of speech that involve the arrangement of words or phrases in a specific order for a specific effect. They often play with syntax, structure, and meaning to create a memorable and powerful impression on the listener or reader. There are several types of construction figures, including antithesis. This involves placing two contrasting or opposing ideas side by side in a sentence or phrase to create a sharp contrast. An example of this is the famous quote from Charles Dickens' novel A Tale of Two Cities: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." Oxymoron. This is a figure of speech that combines two contradictory terms to create a paradoxical effect. An example of an oxymoron is jumbo shrimp or deafening silence. Asyndeton. This involves omitting conjunctions between words or phrases in a sentence or phrase to create a sense of urgency or rapidity. An example of this is the famous quote from Julius Caesar: "I came, I saw, I conquered." Polysyndeton. This is the opposite of asyndeton, involving the use of multiple conjunctions in a sentence or phrase to create a deliberate slowing down effect. An example of this is the famous quote from Winston Churchill: "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills." Construction figures are important because they can help to make language more memorable, persuasive, and powerful. By playing with the structure and syntax of language, construction figures can draw attention to important ideas, emphasize contrasts, and create a sense of rhythm or momentum that can help to hold the listener or reader's attention. Antithesis, oxymoron, asyndeton, and polysyndeton are all construction figures in language. Antithesis is a figure of speech that places contrasting ideas next to each other in a parallel structure. It is often used to create a sense of balance or to emphasize a point. For example, "To be or not to be" is a famous example of antithesis from Shakespeare's play Hamlet. An oxymoron is a figure of speech that combines two contradictory terms or concepts. It is often used to create a paradoxical effect or to emphasize a point. For example, Jumbo shrimp is an oxymoron because the words jumbo and shrimp have opposite meanings. A syndeton is a figure of speech in which conjunctions are omitted between words, phrases, or clauses in a sentence. It is often used to create a sense of urgency or to emphasize the individuality of each item in a list. For example, I came, I saw, I conquered is an example of a syndeton because there are no conjunctions between the verbs. Polysyndeton is the opposite of a syndeton, in that it involves the use of multiple conjunctions in a sentence or phrase. It is often used to create a sense of emphasis or to slow down the pace of the sentence. For example, I ate the pizza and the pasta and the bread and the salad is an example of polysyndeton because the conjunction and is used between each item in the list. These construction figures play an important role in language by adding variety and depth to writing and speech. They can be used to create memorable phrases, emphasize certain ideas, and evoke different emotional responses from the reader or listener. Here are the definitions and examples of each construction figure. Antithesis: this figure of speech places two contrasting ideas side by side in a sentence to create a contrasting effect. It is often used to emphasize the difference between the two ideas. Example: that's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Neil Armstrong. Oxymoron: an oxymoron is a figure of speech in which two contradictory terms are used together in a phrase. Example: jumbo shrimp. A syndeton: this figure of speech involves the omission of conjunctions between clauses or phrases, creating a sense of urgency or rapidity. Example: I came, I saw, I conquered. Julius Caesar. Polysyndeton: polysyndeton is the opposite of a syndeton, where conjunctions are used excessively between clauses or phrases. It creates a sense of emphasis, slowing down the pace of the sentence. Example: we have ships and men and money and stores. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Importance of structure in language and communication. The use of construction figures in language can add a certain structure and rhythm to speech or writing, which can aid in communication and the conveyance of ideas. For example, the use of antithesis can create a clear contrast between two ideas, making them more memorable and impactful. The use of a syndeton or polysyndeton can create a certain pacing or flow to a sentence or paragraph, which can help to emphasize or downplay certain ideas or concepts. Additionally, the use of construction figures can help to create a certain tone or mood in writing or speech. The use of an oxymoron, for example, can create a sense of irony or contradiction, while the use of parallelism can create a sense of balance and harmony. Overall, the careful use of construction figures can enhance the effectiveness of language and aid in effective communication. Applying figures of speech to literature. Figures of speech are a fundamental aspect of literature, and authors use them to create a vivid and expressive language that enhances the meaning and impact of their writing. Some of the most common figures of speech that are used in literature include metaphor, simile, personification, and hyperbole. Here are some examples of how these figures of speech can be applied to literature. Metaphor. A metaphor is a figure of speech that compares two unlike things, creating a comparison without using the words like or as. In literature, metaphors are used to create an imaginative and evocative language that highlights the connections between different objects or concepts. For example, in William Shakespeare's play Macbeth, he uses the metaphor life's but a walking shadow to describe the fleeting and impermanent nature of human existence. Simile. A simile is a figure of speech that compares two things using the words like or as. In literature, similes are often used to create vivid and striking images that help readers to visualize and understand complex ideas. For example, in F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel The Great Gatsby, he uses the simile "her voice is full of money" to describe the alluring and seductive voice of the character Daisy Buchanan. Personification. Personification is a figure of speech that attributes human qualities and characteristics to non-human objects or concepts. In literature, personification is often used to create a more vivid and engaging language that helps readers to connect with abstract ideas on a deeper emotional level. For example, in George Orwell's novel Animal Farm, he uses personification to bring the animal characters to life and to create a powerful allegory about the corrupting influence of power. Hyperbole. Hyperbole is a figure of speech that uses exaggeration to make a point or create a dramatic effect. In literature, hyperbole is often used to create a sense of humor or to convey intense emotion. For example, in Mark Twain's novel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, he uses hyperbole to describe the joy and exhilaration of Tom Sawyer as he runs away from his mundane life and embraces a life of adventure. So, figures of speech are an essential tool in the writer's arsenal, and they play a crucial role in creating a language that is both imaginative and expressive. By using metaphors, similes, personification, hyperbole, and other figures of speech, authors can create a literary language that is both engaging and memorable, and that helps readers to connect with the deeper themes and ideas of their work. Overview of the different genres of literature in the Bible. The Bible is a collection of texts that includes different genres of literature, such as historical narratives, poetry, prophecy, epistles, and apocalyptic literature. The Old Testament contains the historical books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, 1 and 2 Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. It also has the poetic and wisdom books of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. The prophetic books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets also belong to the Old Testament. The New Testament, on the other hand, consists of the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Acts of the Apostles, the letters of Paul, the Catholic or general letters, and the Book of Revelation. The Bible contains a diverse range of literary genres, including poetry, narrative, wisdom literature, prophecy, and apocalyptic literature. Each genre employs different figures of speech to convey its message and create a particular effect on the reader or listener. For example, the Psalms, which are primarily composed of poetry, make extensive use of figurative language. The psalmists employ metaphor, simile, personification, hyperbole, and other figures of speech to express their emotions and experiences, as well as to praise God and ask for His help. For instance, in Psalm 23, the psalmist compares God to a shepherd, using the metaphor to describe God's care and protection. Narrative sections of the Bible also make use of figures of speech to create vivid and memorable images in the reader's mind. For example, in the story of David and Goliath, the writer uses hyperbole to describe the size and strength of Goliath, and then uses irony to emphasize David's unexpected victory over him. Wisdom literature, such as Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job, often use rhetorical questions, parallelism, and other figures of speech to make their points. For instance, Proverbs 26 verses 4-5 uses antithesis to make a point about the danger of arguing with fools. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like unto him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Prophecy and apocalyptic literature use figurative language extensively to convey their messages. For example, in the book of Isaiah, the prophet uses metaphors and symbolism to describe the coming of the Messiah and the restoration of Israel. In the book of Revelation, the author uses a variety of figures of speech, including symbolism, allegory, and hyperbole, to describe the end of the world and the final judgment. Overall, the different genres of literature in the Bible each use figures of speech to create a distinct effect on the reader or listener. Understanding these figures of speech can help readers to better appreciate the literary richness and complexity of the Bible. Here are some examples of different figures of speech used in various genres of the Bible. Historical narrative. Metaphor. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the old heaven and the old earth had disappeared. Revelation 21 verse 1. Simile. Their arrows shall be as of a skilled warrior. Jeremiah 50 verse 9. Hyperbole. Now the Jordan is at flood stage all during harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. Joshua 3 verses 15 to 16. Poetry. Metaphor. The Lord is my rock, my fortress and my Savior, my God is my rock, in whom I find protection. He is my shield, the strength of my salvation, and my stronghold. Psalm 18 verse 2. Simile. As the deer pants for streams of water, so my soul pants for you, my God. Psalm 42 verse 1. Personification. Let the sea resound, and everything in it, the world, and all who live in it. Psalm 98 verse 7. Wisdom literature. Metaphor. The teaching of the wise is a fountain of life, turning a person from the snares of death. Proverbs 13 verse 14. Simile. Like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Proverbs 25 verse 28. Hyperbole. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. Proverbs 26 verse 14. Prophetic literature. Metaphor. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me you can do nothing. John 15 verse 5. Simile. Your love is like the morning mist, like the early dew that disappears. Hosea 6 verse 4. Personification. The earth dries up and withers, the world languishes and withers, the heavens languish with the earth. Isaiah 24 verse 4. Epistles. Metaphor. For we are God's handiwork, created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which God prepared in advance for us to do. Ephesians 2 verse 10. Simile. Like newborn babies, crave pure spiritual milk, so that by it you may grow up in your salvation. 1 Peter 2 verse 2. Hyperbole. And every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Philippians 2 verse 11. These are just a few examples, and the Bible contains numerous other instances of various figures of speech across different genres. Conclusion. In conclusion, figures of speech are important in language as they enhance communication by making language more interesting, powerful, and memorable. The different types of figures of speech discussed in this episode include repetition figures, analogy figures, and construction figures. Each type serves a specific purpose in language and can be applied in various genres of literature, including those found in the Bible. The Bible is a diverse collection of literary genres that employ different figures of speech, such as allegory, metaphor, and antithesis. Understanding the use of figures of speech in literature can enhance our appreciation and understanding of the text. Recap of the different types of figures of speech and their importance in language. Figures of speech are an essential part of language, as they enable us to communicate more effectively by creating more vivid and memorable images in the minds of our listeners or readers. Here's a recap of the different types we covered. Repetition figures, anaphora, pleonasm, gradation, parallelism, repetition. These figures repeat words, phrases, or ideas for emphasis, clarity, or artistic effect. Analogy figures, allegory, personification, comparison, metaphor. These figures use comparisons to help explain complex or abstract ideas, or to evoke certain emotions or associations in the audience. Exaggeration and attenuation figures, hyperbole, understatement, preterition, euphemism, antiphrasis. These figures use exaggeration or understatement to create a humorous or ironic effect, or to convey sensitive or taboo subjects. Construction figures, antithesis, oxymoron, asyndeton, polysyndeton. These figures use different structures to create contrasts, paradoxes, or rhythmic patterns in the language. In addition, we discussed the importance of figures of speech in different genres of literature, such as poetry, prophecy, wisdom literature, and narrative. Each genre employs different figures of speech to achieve its unique literary aims, such as conveying deep emotions, inspiring moral wisdom, predicting future events, or recounting historical narratives. Overall, figures of speech enrich our language by adding layers of meaning, beauty, and emotional impact. Whether in literature, public speaking, or everyday conversation, they help us to connect with our audience more deeply and effectively, and to convey our message with greater power and clarity. Final thoughts on the role of figures of speech in effective communication. Figures of speech are essential tools in language and communication as they add depth and meaning to our words. They are used to create emphasis, convey complex ideas, and evoke emotions in the listener or reader. By using figures of speech, we can make our communication more memorable and effective. Each figure of speech has its unique characteristics and purpose, and different types of figures of speech are employed depending on the context and genre of communication. Understanding these figures of speech can help us not only to appreciate the beauty of language, but also to communicate more effectively. In conclusion, figures of speech are not just stylistic elements of language, but essential tools that can be used to communicate ideas and emotions more effectively. Whether we are speaking or writing, the use of figures of speech can help us to capture our audience's attention, convey our message more effectively, and leave a lasting impression. Understanding the different types of figures of speech and their use in the Bible can be helpful in interpreting and understanding the text. It can help readers to appreciate the literary artistry of the Bible and to discern the intended meaning behind the figurative language. Additionally, studying the use of figures of speech in the Bible can also provide insight into the cultural and historical context of the time in which the text was written. In conclusion, the use of figurative language is an essential aspect of effective communication. Figures of speech can enhance the clarity, impact, and beauty of language, whether in literature or everyday conversations. Understanding the different types of figures of speech, such as repetition, analogy, exaggeration and attenuation, and construction, can help us become more proficient in using language to convey our messages effectively. The Bible is an excellent example of how figures of speech can be employed in different genres of literature, such as poetry, parables, and apocalyptic literature. The use of figures of speech in the Bible adds depth and richness to the messages conveyed and can help readers gain a deeper understanding of spiritual truths. Overall, the study of figurative language is a valuable tool for enhancing our communication skills and enriching our spiritual lives. By incorporating these techniques into our communication, we can become more effective and persuasive communicators, sharing our thoughts and ideas with clarity, precision, and power. Thank you for joining us today to explore the art of figurative language and its relevance in our daily communication and spiritual growth. Figures of speech can help us express complex ideas, emotions, and experiences in ways that resonate with others and create meaningful connections. By understanding and using different figures of speech, we can deepen our spiritual insights, enrich our relationships, and enhance our ability to inspire and lead others. We hope that this discussion has been informative and inspiring for you. Join us again next time for another insightful episode on spirituality in society.